What if the story we were taught about the beginning was only the beginning of a story someone wanted us to believe? The question rests softly at the edge of consciousness, the way an old memory sometimes surfaces without a clear reason, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and forgotten pages. There's a strangeness in the oldest layers of human memory, a quiet disturbance, subtle yet persistent, like the soft pressure of a thumbprint left on clay thousands of years ago. When we reach into the past, our hands close not on answers, but on an emptiness too deliberate to be accidental. Something interrupts the past before it even begins, a void where origin should be, as though a chapter was torn away so cleanly that even the edges forget they once held text. And, before you let your body sink fully into this comfort, take a small moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if something in these whispers makes you want to stay a little longer. If you wish, share the place and time where you're listening. I'm always curious about the tiny points of light drifting through tonight with us. Beneath the familiar timeline, Mesopotamia rising from the rivers, Egypt lifting its monuments toward the constellations, the Indus culture weaving patterns into stone. There lies a deeper murmur that historians have never fully resolved. It is not a theory, nor a fringe idea, but a pattern of absence. Things that should exist but don't. Achievements whose roots appear too mature, too polished, too abrupt. Civilizations do not typically begin in a state of fluency. Yet humanity's first steps onto the stage of history look strangely like mid-steps, as though guided by a memory that should have belonged to someone else. The earliest cities appear already knowing how to build walls, how to arrange homes, how to cultivate grain. The first writing systems do not begin as childish sketches. They emerge already capable of administrating economies. It is as if human culture awakened from a dream it could not quite recall, but still retained its structure. Archaeologists for more than a century have quietly admitted that something does not add up. Göbekli Tepe, for example, rises out of prehistory like a contradiction carved in stone. Circles of pillars weighing tons, erected by hunter-gatherers who supposedly lacked hierarchy, architecture, or even agriculture. Yet there the pillars stand, aligned, carved, deliberate. A creation that would challenge societies thousands of years later, somehow built by people with no known precedent. The site itself was buried intentionally, as though its builders hid it not from time, but from someone who would come after, or perhaps from those who were already watching. But the question that lingers is not simply how such structures were built. It is why the world before them appears so thoroughly erased. In many regions, layers of soil that should hold evidence of gradual development instead hold silence. The archaeological record narrows, compresses, and then suddenly erupts with complexity. One might call it a miracle of human ingenuity, but miracles rarely arrive without shadows. When growth is too rapid, too synchronized across continents, it invites an unsettling alternative. Perhaps this knowledge was not born but inherited. Hesitation surrounds such ideas. Academia favors what can be measured, not what can be sensed. Yet even within the academic world, whispers persist of a time before time, of lost coastal settlements swallowed by rising seas 11,000 years ago, of migrations older than any written chronicle, of oral traditions that speak not of beginnings but of returns. Many indigenous cultures describe their ancestors as survivors, not pioneers, survivors of what remains unclear. That the consistency of their language, something was lost, something was destroyed, something forced humanity to begin again, folds neatly into the archaeological gaps. And still, the silence sits heavier in some places than in others. The Sumerians, often credited with launching the age of civilization, spoke not of inventing knowledge but of receiving it. Their earliest texts attribute writing, agriculture, and city building to figures who descended, figures who remembered what humans had forgotten. In Egypt, the earliest dynasties look back to a time of the gods, a period of reigns so long they stretch belief, yet appear in king lists with perfect confidence. The Maya describe previous worlds, each destroyed and remade. The Greeks wrote of ages of fire and water, of knowledge drowned and knowledge rediscovered. Even Plato's tale of Atlantis, often dismissed as allegory, positioned itself not as fantasy but as memory. A memory passed down by priests who insisted it came from a time before human arrogance reshaped the earth. When so many civilizations recall an earlier erased epoch, it becomes difficult to dismiss them all as coincidence. Human imagination is powerful, yes, but collective amnesia is equally powerful. And the places where these stories converge, floods, celestial upheavals, civilizations falling under waves or ice, mirror geological evidence of dramatic global shifts at the end of the last ice age. Sea levels rose sharply, entire coastlines vanished, species disappeared, and with them perhaps something else vanished too. The first keepers of knowledge, or the first attempt at civilization, or something even more elusive, an entire chapter of humanity that left only its shadow on the walls of the cave. This possibility is uncomfortable. It unroots the familiar narrative and invites questions that no institution is eager to entertain. If there was a world before our world, what happened to it? If its knowledge survived, who preserved it? And who decided what would be passed on? Was the loss natural or curated? Was history shaped by disaster or by human hands? And if hands, whose? The discomfort grows more profound when considering how much evidence of early humanity lies hidden under oceans. The Earth we study is not the Earth our ancestors walked. More than 10 million square kilometers of land were drowned after the last glacial melt, land that would have hosted rivers, valleys, and the earliest migrations. Land where stories older than any tablet or inscription might have been carved into stone, yet we cannot reach them. The sea guards them with a quietness that feels almost intentional. Perhaps this is why the beginning feels so incomplete, why origins look like remnants rather than foundations. We search for the first spark of civilization, but what we find instead is the fading ember of something older, something disrupted, something obscured not just by time, but by choice. The mystery is not why civilization began suddenly. It is why the remnants of what came before seem scattered, veiled, or deliberately withheld. And so, the question returns, soft but insistent. If this is the beginning we were allowed to remember, what was the beginning we were never meant to know? There is a peculiar ache that rises when one looks closely at the earlier cities, an ache not born from nostalgia, but from the awareness that something about their appearance in the archaeological record feels strangely rehearsed. It is as though humanity stepped onto a stage already furnished with tools, symbols, and knowledge that should have taken millennia to accumulate. Long before empires formed, long before writings spread across the Near East, there were places that emerged suddenly, with an intelligence that feels older than the soil beneath them. And if part one left a soft tremor in the mind, a suspicion that the official story of origins is too neat, then the earlier settlements of our species deepen that tremor into something more enduring. Consider Göbekli Tepe again, not as an isolated marvel, but as the first ripple of a pattern. Hunter-gatherers, according to the traditional model, lived without social hierarchy, without architecture, without the need for monumental space. Yet here, more than 11,000 years ago, people carved towering pillars, eliciting them in circles, and etched animals with artistic precision. No earlier structure foreshadows it. No crude prototypes exist. The first monument arrives as a masterpiece, and the burden of explanation rests heavily on a question that no one can answer cleanly. Where did the knowledge come from? Jericho too unsettles the narrative. Its massive stone tower, dating to around 8,000 BCE, appears at a time when small farming villages should have been taking their first tentative steps towards sedentary life. Yet the tower is mathematically aligned with the solstice sunset, suggesting not only engineering ability, but an awareness of long-term celestial cycles. The technical understanding embedded within its design exceeds what we expect of a community that, by conventional measures, had barely begun to experiment with agriculture. The tower stands as if it belonged to a lineage of builders whose earlier works were swept away. Çatalhöyük adds another layer of strangeness. An urban settlement without streets, its homes arranged so densely that people moved across roofs rather than roads, navigating the city like a hive. Wall paintings show vultures, headless bodies, and geometric layouts reminiscent of ritual or cosmology. But what stands out most is the psychological maturity of its inhabitants, the sense that their worldview was already complex, symbolic, interior. This was not a society learning how to think, it was a society remembering how to express something ancient. Historians who adhere to gradualist models often attempt to explain these anomalies by pointing to environmental pressure or the slow accumulation of cultural memory. Yet the gaps remain. How does one account for the fact that pottery appears in some regions fully formed, not in an observable developmental arc? How do we interpret early metallurgy sites, like Chaioni, where copper was being cold-hammered several thousand years before metallurgy should exist? Why does agriculture rise independently in so many places within such a narrow time window? The timeline looks less like a gradual evolution and more like a synchronized awakening. Some scholars have proposed that these leaps were the result of what they call punctuated cultural equilibrium, a sudden burst of innovation after long periods of stasis. But innovation leaves fingerprints, transitional forms, failed experiments, intermediary attempts. What we find instead are cultural blossoms with no roots, not seedlings but full-grown trees, and the absence of roots invites an unsettling possibility. Perhaps those roots existed, but in a world now submerged, burned, or erased. Perhaps these early societies inherited the last sparks of something older, something that once thrived before the end of the last ice age. Coastal archaeology has begun to whisper the same suspicion. Off the shores of India, the underwater remains at Dwarka, and the Gulf of Kumbat include patterned foundations older than expected for the region. Doggerland, once a vast landscape connecting Britain to Europe, holds signs of occupation before it sank beneath the North Sea. The remnants scattered along the coasts of Japan and the Mediterranean also hint at settlements drowned by rising seas between 9000 and 6000 BCE. If early humans lived along coastlines, and most populations do, then the majority of prehistoric cultural centers now lie beneath the ocean, unreachable, unseen. The absence in our timeline may not be an absence of existence, but an absence of access. This framing does not require speculative civilizations or lost continents. It only requires acknowledging that the world we study is not the world our ancestors inhabited. When 10 million square kilometers of land vanish underwater, so does the developmental arc of humanity. What remains on land is not the full story, but the last surviving outposts. Hilltop shrines, inland refuges, settlements founded by survivors of a vast rewiring of the planet's geography. If survivors carried fragments of knowledge inland, then early sites like Göbekli Tepe, Jericho, and Çatalhöyük may not represent beginnings at all. They may represent attempts to preserve memory, ritual, or cosmology in the aftermath of a trauma we barely understand. The abrupt sophistication of these sites could hint not at sudden genius, but at deliberate reconstruction. And the strangeness surrounding their emergence, the lack of prototypes, the ritualistic undertones, the astronomical awareness, begins to feel less like anomaly and more like echo, yet the echo's muffled, yet a silence surrounds the formative centuries of these settlements, as though something intercepts our ability to look further back. The soil is stingy, the record is faint, oral traditions remember a world destroyed, not a world created. And throughout this, Another question coils quietly beneath the surface. If these early societies inherited knowledge, who or what preserved it for them? This question touches the edges of discomfort within academic circles. Ideas of knowledge transfer from unknown predecessors risk opening doors to misinterpretation or mythologizing. But the question is not about myth, it is about patterns. When we see similar architectural motifs, similar symbolic systems, and similar cosmological structures emerging across continents in a compressed time frame, we must ask whether humanity was guided by a shared memory, a memory that survived catastrophe, a memory scattered among tribes who themselves had forgotten its origin. And then comes the more delicate possibility, one that some researchers hint at but rarely state overtly. Perhaps the knowledge survived not only through memory, but through a group of individuals specifically tasked with preserving it. Not gods in the supernatural sense, but a class of knowledge keepers or elders who carried traditions across the rupture in time. In many myths, these figures descend, but descent need not be literal. It could be the descent of lineage, of inheritance, of a group who remembered the world before the world and transmitted only fragments after the fall. If so, then the early civilizations that appear too early may be the last lanterns flickering after a great darkness, not the first sparks of human ingenuity. And if that is true, then the timeline we inherited, the one we teach, the one we trust, may be less an account of beginnings and more an edited reconstruction of what was left after the erasure. Which leaves one final quiet question drifting in the dark. If these early cultures were only rebuilding, then what kind of world had come before them, and why does its outline still tremble beneath the surface of our own? There is a certain heaviness that settles in the mind when contemplating the great works of stone scattered across the world, work so precise, so immovable, so far beyond what their supposed builders should have been capable of, that they seem to belong to another chapter of human history altogether. If the earlier settlements whisper of knowledge inherited, then these stones feel like the last surviving sentences of a language no one remembers how to speak. They stand with a confidence that ordinary time cannot erode, and yet they do not boast. Their presence is quieter than that. Quiet in the way an old witness becomes silent not because it has nothing to say, but because it has said everything already, and no one wanted to hear it. Perhaps the most jarring example is Baalbek, where the trilithon blocks lie in a row of impossible magnitude. Each weighing more than 800 tons, they sit so perfectly aligned that even modern cranes struggle to replicate such placement. The civilizations we credit with building them, the Romans, the Byzantines, added structures on top of the platform, but none claim to have created the platform itself. It is as though the foundation was already there, a remnant of something older, and later cultures simply adapted to its existence. The stones themselves do not explain their origin. They simply are, profound in their refusal to be reduced to a simple answer. Further west, Sacsayhuaman rises with his own defiance. Stones weighing dozens of tons interlock with such accuracy that not even a sheet of paper can slide between them. The faces of the blocks are subtly curved, their angles meeting in a geometry that suggests an intimate understanding of load distribution. To call this primitive architecture feels almost disrespectful, not to the builders, but to the stones themselves, which seem to carry a memory of hands that worked with an intelligence slightly out of step with what we think human societies possessed. The fact that these structures were assembled without mortar, using irregular shapes instead of uniform blocks, makes their precision more, not less, astonishing. And then there is Puma Punku, with its perfect right angles and millimeter-level cuts carved into andesite, a stone harder than granite. Modern engineers examining the site often comment on the peculiar signatures of tooling, grooves and slots so regular that they resemble mechanical fabrication. Yet the Tiwanaku culture, to whom we attribute the site, had no metal tools capable of shaping such stone at that level of precision. Some researchers suggest these features were shaped with stone hammers, water, and sand. Perhaps, but if one stands quietly before the carved blocks, listening to the stillness that surrounds them, an uncomfortable thought rises. The explanations feel smaller than the stones themselves. If all these structures belong to the cultures we claim built them, we would expect a technological gradient. Experiments, failed designs, gradual improvement. Instead, many of these sites appear suddenly, already skilled. It is as though the builders inherited techniques rather than invented them. But inherited from whom? And why do the earliest examples often remain the most impressive, while later attempts decline in precision? Even underwater, the story repeats. Off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, submerged terraces and geometric formations stir ongoing debate. Some argue they are natural, shaped by tectonic patterns and erosion. Others point to the deliberate right angles, the stair-like platforms, and the presence of what appeared to be retaining walls. The site lies at a depth consistent with sea levels around 10,000 years ago, a period that aligns with the global meltwater pulses following the last glacial maximum. If the formations are human-made, they belong to a time before any known Japanese civilization, and so the debate becomes less about geology and more about discomfort. What would it mean to admit that sophisticated structures existed before the cultures we attribute them to? This discomfort is not academic arrogance. It is narrative inertia. The story of humanity is built on the assumption of linear progress. Hunter-gatherers lead to early farmers lead to villages lead to cities lead to mathematics, writing, and engineering. But what if the lesson bends backward? What if fragments of a world before ours survived the great shifts of climate and sea, and the people who inherited them could not fully replicate what they found? In that case, the precision stonework of ancient sites is not evidence of progress. It is evidence of memory fading. There is a term sometimes used in archaeology, technic overshoot. It describes artifacts whose sophistication exceeds what the broader culture appears capable of supporting. But perhaps the term should be reversed. Perhaps the artifacts are not overshooting. Perhaps the cultural model is undershooting. Perhaps the model has forgotten to account for the possibility that knowledge does not always begin at zero. Some researchers have drawn parallels between the layout of ancient sites across continents, noting alignments with cardinal directions, solstice markers, and celestial cycles that would require long-term observations. Observations difficult to imagine for societies believed to be in their infancy. Baalbek's orientation, Giza's stellar alignments, Teotihuacan's astronomical geometry, each reflects a connection between stone and sky. As if the builders were not simply constructing monuments but restoring a blueprint. It is tempting in moments like this to imagine lost civilizations with advanced technology. But the truth may be simpler, quieter, more human. Knowledge need not be futuristic to be profound. A society with deep observational wisdom, stable traditions, and mastery of stone could accomplish feats that feel impossible to us, precisely because we lost the worldview they carried. Even so, the presence of such continuity across continents raises a question. If this worldview existed, who preserved it long enough for it to scatter into the early cultures of post-Ice Age humanity? In many myths, the answer is not a civilization, but a group. The 7 sages of Mesopotamia, the Apakalu, appear after the flood to restore knowledge to humankind. In Greece, the first architects and lawgivers are described as sons of gods or survivors of earlier ages. In the Andes, Viracocha is said to have retaught humanity how to build and measure. These stories vary in detail but not in shape. They describe teachers, not inventors, restorers, not creators. Yet the academic world treats them as metaphors. But metaphors for what? Perhaps for individuals who carried fragments of stone lore across the rupture in human history, preserving techniques long after the civilization that developed them had vanished. If so, their influence would appear scattered, incomplete, inconsistent, precisely as our archaeological record does. Of course, no definitive evidence exists for such predecessors, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when much of the prehistoric world lies beneath the sea, and the stones, quiet, patient, unmoving, seem almost to understand that time will eventually be asked to explain itself. The question lingering at the end of this reflection is not how ancient builders achieved their feats. It is why these feats appear as the fading endpoint of knowledge rather than its beginning, which invites a deeper, more uneasy wondering. If these stones are the last monuments of an earlier world, then what happened to the people who first learned to carve memory into rock? And why did their echoes survive while their voices did not? There is a moment in every inquiry when the silence of the past becomes too consistent to ignore. When the same story, told in different languages, in different climates, across entire oceans, begins to sound less like mythology and more like encoded memory. That moment often arrives when one turns to the ancient tales of floods, the deluges that swallow worlds, erase knowledge, and force humanity to begin again. They're not small stories. They're not local storms described with embellished detail. They're global cataclysms recorded by civilizations that never met, separated by continents and by time, yet united in their description of a world undone. And once this pattern appears, it becomes difficult not to sense a deeper intention behind the tales, as though the flood is both an event and a veil. In Mesopotamia, the flood is a divine reckoning, sweeping away a civilization that had grown unruly. In the Hebrew tradition, it is a purification, a cleansing of corruption. In India, Manusmriti recalls Manu being warned of rising waters that would end the age. In China, Yu the Great labors against great inundations said to have reshaped the landscape. The Maya record a prior world destroyed by water. The Ojibwe, the Inca, the Aboriginal Australians, all remember a time when ocean and sky conspired to end what existed before. Such unanimity is startling enough. But what is more striking is what these stories imply, that the world before the flood was not primitive, but structured, populated, organized. A world with knowledge, a world with memory worth preserving. And then, around 12,800 years ago, nature presents an echo of these myths. A geological anomaly, meltwater pulse 1a. Sea levels rise dramatically. Some estimates suggest a jump of nearly 20 meters within centuries, a transformation swift enough to drown entire coastlines. Around the same time, the Younger Dryas begins, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions lasting more than a millennium. Something interrupts the warming trend, plunging the northern hemisphere into cold. Lake Agassiz breaches, ice sheets collapse, oceans surge. Whether caused by comet fragments, volcanic activity, or shifts in oceanic circulation, the effect is undeniable. A world destabilized. Archaeologists have long attempted to reconcile this event with the universality of flood mythology. Some argue that humans simply project meaning onto natural disasters, but there is a difference between localized floods and global transformation. The end of the Pleistocene was not a singular incident. It was a cascade, oceans rising, coastlines vanishing, climates swinging between extremes. If human societies existed along the shorelines, and all evidence suggests they did, then their worlds would have disappeared rapidly, not gradually. Their settlements would have been swallowed, their maps erased, their memories perhaps rendered sacred because they were the only fragments left. It is no coincidence that so many early traditions speak of knowledge entrusted to survivors. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim preserves wisdom. In the Vedas, Manu carries seeds of life. In Greek tradition, Deucalion rebuilds civilization. These figures are not inventors. They're inheritors, custodians, carrying remnants of something older into a world newly fragile. The flood then becomes more than an act of destruction. It becomes a boundary, a line drawn between two epochs, separating what came before from what we are allowed to remember. The most haunting element of this boundary is the archaeological silence surrounding the millennia, just before the rise of early agriculture. We know humans lived. We know they migrated, hunted, crafted tools. But evidence of cultural complexity remains elusive, not because it did not exist, but because the landscapes where such complexity may have formed are now underwater. When the sea level rose, it claimed coastal plains, deltas, fertile basins, precisely the regions where early human societies would have thrived. What we study today is not the whole tapestry, but the frayed fringe that survived inland. This realization casts an altered light upon the earliest known civilizations. If they appear to advance for their time, perhaps it is because they were not inventing civilization. They were restoring it, stitching together whatever fragments the flood did not take. Göbekli Tepe's sudden sophistication, Jericho's astronomical tower, the twilight echoes of lost sites like Doggerland, or the sunken ruins near the Indian coast. All of these may belong to a narrative of rebuilding, a narrative in which survivors held onto what they could and attempted to reassemble the world from memory. The concept of cultural amnesia often arises in anthropological discussions, yet it is usually applied to belief systems or language shifts. But what if it applies to civilization itself? A collective forgetting imposed not by ignorance, but by catastrophe. If humanity underwent a cycle of loss and rebirth, then the disjointed emergence of early cultural centers makes sense. They were not starting from scratch, they were remembering unevenly. And yet, there is another element within the flood narratives that invites deeper contemplation. The idea that some knowledge was intentionally withheld or removed. The Sumerians speak of the gods hiding the me, the divine decrees of civilization, until humanity proved worthy. Egyptian texts speak of sacred writings hidden after calamity. Even Greek traditions describe secrets guarded by priests who claim they came from a world before the waters. These images suggest that the rupture was not merely natural but epistemic, as though someone or some group believed that certain truths should not cross into the new age intact. This does not require an external force or supernatural agency. Human societies themselves are capable of restricting knowledge, especially in times of upheaval. Elders, priestly orders, remnants of a once great culture. Any of these could have decided that only pieces of the old world should survive, or perhaps the knowledge was simply too vast to be preserved in full. Memory fades, languages shift, symbols lose meaning. And in the wake of trauma, people cling not to instruction but to ritual, myth, and story. But if the flood was a veil, then veils can be lifted. Geological records, submerged ruins, anomalous artifacts, each offers a glimpse through the curtain. And myths, far from being childish exaggerations, may hold the emotional truth of lived experience. They are stories told not to entertain but to remember. Stories designed to outlast the collapse of libraries and the drowning of cities. The weight of this possibility carries a subtle melancholy. It suggests that humanity today walks upon the world not as pioneers but as descendants of survivors. People whose ancestors carried torches through a long night, hoping that the dawn would come before the flame went out. And it suggests that our greatest ignorance is not of the future, but of the past we never fully inherited. Yet the flood myths share one more motif, delicate but persistent, the idea that warnings were given, that someone foresaw the collapse, that someone guided certain individuals towards survival. Whether these figures were real or metaphorical, they emphasize a final, unsettling point. The world before the flood was not lost suddenly. It was lost with witnesses, and if there were witnesses, then perhaps the silence that surrounds that world today is not simply the silence of erosion and time, but the silence of something deliberately left unsaid. There is a particular kind of silence in history, not the silence of absence, but the silence of removal. It is the quiet that follows a page torn from a manuscript, the hush that lingers after fire consumes a library. It is the silence created not by time, but by hands. As humanity walked forward from the turmoil of the post-Ice Age world, it began building archives, carving tablets, copying scrolls, storing knowledge in temples, towers, and underground chambers, and repeatedly, across continents and eras, these repositories of memory met the same fate: destruction, erasure, or disappearance. The pattern is too rhythmic to dismiss as coincidence. It forms a dark undercurrent running beneath our timeline, shaping what we think we know and concealing what might have been. The most famous example, almost mythic in the modern imagination, is the Library of Alexandria. People often speak of its burning as though it were a single event, a tragic spark that consumed centuries of wisdom. But the truth is more complicated and more unsettling. Alexandria was damaged multiple times: during Caesar's campaign, under Aurelian, during religious upheavals, and later possibly under decree. Each incident chipped away at its vast collection: texts on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, geography, and accounts of older traditions inherited from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece. Whether the final blow was intentional or accidental matters less than the pattern: a center of knowledge repeatedly threatened until it vanished entirely. What remains today is not certainty, but a long, hollow ache, an awareness that the absence itself may have reshaped human understanding more profoundly than anything the library ever preserved. Yet Alexandria is not an anomaly. It is a symbol of a phenomenon that appears again and again. Consider the Library of Ashurbanipal, a treasure of cuneiform tablets rescued only because they were baked into clay by the fires that destroyed them. Many of these texts were already copies of older works, themselves drawn from earlier Sumerian sources. They preserve hints of traditions, sciences, and cosmological ideas that appear far more mature than expected for their time. The Epic of Gilgamesh, flood narratives, astronomical records. These are fragments of something larger. But where are the oldest originals? Where are the proto-archives that must have preceded such complexity? If they existed, they're gone, leaving only these echoes. Other losses were more deliberate. In China, the Qin dynasty famously ordered the burning of books and the burying of scholars. The incident is often framed as a consolidation of political power, but the philosophical undercurrent is clear. History, if left unaltered, can undermine authority. And so it was pruned. Entire schools of thought disappeared, leaving Confucian and legalist traditions to dominate future interpretation of the ancient past. What vanished with those flames remained unknown, but the act itself reveals the vulnerability of truth when it threatens structure. In the Americas, the pattern repeats with chilling symmetry. When Spanish clergy encountered Maya and Aztec codices, they deemed them dangerous, pagan, heretical, and destroyed them en masse. Bishop Diego de Lunda famously burned countless Maya manuscripts, later writing with strange remorse that the people regretted it to an amazing degree and were grieved. Today, only a handful survive. Fragile windows into a worldview that once spanned mathematics, astronomy, mythology, and history. What knowledge died in those flames? What cycles of time, or what earlier memories? What sacred science? We cannot know. The past was edited, and the editors did not leave footnotes. Even discoveries that escaped destruction often did so through sheer luck. The Dead Sea Scrolls survived only because they were hidden in caves, sealed inside jars for nearly 2,000 years. The Nag Hammadi texts were buried in clay. The Oxyrhynchus papyri were preserved by desert sands. The Tertaria tablets, a set of signs older than Sumerian writing, were found not in a library but in a pit. These are not archives, they are survivors, and survivors by definition imply catastrophe. Once one becomes aware of this pattern, it becomes difficult to resist the sense that humanity has repeatedly passed through narrows, moments when knowledge was stripped, filtered, or reinterpreted through the priorities of those in power. is not necessary to imagine conspiracies or secret councils to understand this process. Human institutions naturally protect the narratives that legitimize them. Empires reinforce their origins. Priesthoods reinforce their doctrines. Dynasties reinforce their genealogies. In doing so, they often reshape the past to stabilize the present. But the most subtle form of erasure is not the burning of libraries. It is the quiet redirection of attention. When certain texts are preserved while others disappear, when certain stories are copied while others fade, when certain interpretations become orthodoxy while others are deemed unimportant, that too is a form of editing. And over centuries, such editing creates a version of history that feels seamless, coherent, complete. Yet beneath that smooth surface lies a terrain of missing chapters. One cannot help but wonder, what kind of world would we see if those chapters had survived? Would we view early civilizations as abrupt anomalies, or as the descendants of something older? Would we see flood myths as symbolic morality tales, or as encoded memories of geological upheaval? Would the sudden appearance of writing, agriculture, mathematics, and astronomy seem miraculous, or merely the continuation of older traditions whose origins are now lost? The idea that history has been curated is unsettling precisely because it challenges our sense of continuity. We want the story of our past to unfold with orderly logic, one age giving rise to the next. But the archaeological record refuses to obey. It offers not a ladder but fragments, brilliant fragments, whose missing context forces us to accept that our view of early humanity is incomplete. Some scholars speak cautiously about bottlenecks of knowledge, periods when much of the world's intellectual heritage was vulnerable to loss. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age, the fall of Rome, the destruction of Mesoamerican civilizations. Each event narrowed the channels through which the past could speak, and each event was followed by a rewriting of origins. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of all is that many ancient cultures seemed aware of this vulnerability. They wrote of knowledge hidden away for future ages, at times when humanity would be ready, or when the world would be safe again. Egyptian temple inscriptions speak of secret texts concealed in boxes beneath the earth. Mesopotamian myths describe the fundamental powers of civilization, hidden after the flood. Greek sources hint at mysteries taught only to initiates. Even the Hebrew tradition preserves the idea of sealed books meant to be opened only at the end of days. These are not the gestures of societies confident in the permanence of their archives. They are the gestures of societies that feared forgetting, societies that saw knowledge not as a possession, but as a fragile inheritance that could easily be lost if the world turned once more toward chaos. And so, when we examine the gaps in our understanding today, they may not be the result of simple chance. They may be the result of a long lineage of losses, edits, drownings, burnings and silencings. A world before ours may have existed, but its voice reaches us only in fragments that survived by accident or intention. Which leaves us with a question that can only linger without resolution. If this is the history that endured despite countless erasures, what kind of truth once existed in the histories that did not survive at all? There comes a moment, somewhere along the winding path of the ancient world, when the boundary between myth and memory stops feeling firm. It loosens, then blurs, and suddenly one is no longer certain whether the figures standing at the dawn of civilization were creations of imagination or recollections of someone real, someone remembered imperfectly, filtered through generations of trauma, survival, and rebuilding. Nearly every early culture speaks of a time when gods walked among humans, not as ethereal beings of infinite power, but as teachers, lawgivers, founders, bearers of knowledge that humanity could not have acquired alone. And when the stories are placed side by side, they do not form a collection of fantasies. They form a pattern, a repeated assertion that civilization did not begin with invention, but with instruction. In Mesopotamia, the tradition speaks of the Anunnaki and the Upkalu, beings who descended after the flood to restore the lost arts of civilization. They brought writing, agriculture, measurement, kingship. They did not merely teach skills, they rebuilt order. What is remarkable is not the supernatural attributes that later interpretations assign to them, but the matter-of-fact tone with which ancient scribes treated their existence. The Upkalu were described almost as historical figures, included in king lists and administrative texts, their influence woven into the fabric of early governance. It is difficult to read these accounts without sensing that the Cimmerians saw themselves not as pioneers, but as heirs. A similar theme appears in Egypt, where the earliest dynasties refer back to a time governed by the followers of Horus, and before them, a lineage of divine kings whose reigns stretched for millennia. The Palermo stone lists these rulers with the same formal structure used for historical kings, as though the Egyptians believed that something, someone, had shaped their world long before the first pharaoh unified the two lands. Thoth, the god of writing and knowledge, was said to have preserved sacred texts from earlier ages, anticipating calamities that might sweep the world clean. Again, the implication is not invention, but preservation. In the Andes, the figure of Viracocha emerges from the mist of myth as a teacher who traveled among the people after a great flood, re-establishing knowledge, instructing survivors, bringing stability back to a fractured world. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl plays a similar role, associated with astronomy, mathematics, and the renewal of civilization after cycles of destruction. These beings are often depicted not as remote spiritual forces, but as travelers, architects, or sages, whose knowledge far exceeded that of the people they aided. The pattern expands further. In ancient Greece, the first lawgivers and architects are said to be semi-divine, descending from earlier, more luminous ages. Prometheus gives fire, not a flame, but a symbol of intelligence, technique, and foresight. In India, the rishis receive knowledge of the cosmos as revelation, not invention. The Vedas describe cycles of creation and destruction, with each new age inheriting fragments of the last. Across Polynesia, cultural heroes such as Maui draw up islands, craft tools, reshape the world after floods and upheavals. The stories are separated by oceans, but aligned in essence. What makes these traditions compelling is not their supernatural framing. Mythology naturally embellishes. What matters is the underlying motif. Knowledge comes from outside the broken world, restored by figures who appear at liminal moments, after the flood, after the darkness, after the collapse. They arrive as if carrying memory across an epochal divide. And if this motif occurred once, one might dismiss it, but it appears everywhere. Some historians treat these stories as metaphors for a rare class of early intellectuals, astronomer priests, engineers, navigators, who preserved fragments of pre-flood knowledge. Others suggest these myths encode the arrival of refugees from drowned coastlines, bringing with them agricultural and architectural techniques. Still others see them as symbolic expressions of humanity's longing for continuity after catastrophe. But what unites these interpretations is the acknowledgement that the myths describe inheritance, not innovation. It is also striking how these figures are depicted with uncanny consistency. Tall, radiant, wise, often associated with teaching through symbols rather than words. They appear suddenly, then vanish, often returning to the sea or ascending to the sky. Metaphors perhaps for the destruction of their homelands or the fading of their lineage. Their presence is liminal, not quite human, not quite divine, belonging to a threshold between worlds. The reluctance of modern scholarship to take these accounts seriously is understandable. To do so risks opening the door to speculation that drifts beyond what evidence can support. Yet avoiding the accounts entirely creates an opposite problem. It flattens the emotional truth embedded in ancient memory. Myths endure not because they entertain, but because they encode something essential, something that facts alone cannot preserve. The question, then, is not whether the Anunnaki or Viracocha or Thoth were literal beings, The question is why the earliest civilizations consistently portrayed themselves as recipients rather than inventors. What did they believe they had lost? What rupture did they think separated them from the world before? And why did they consistently attribute their societal foundations to figures associated with an earlier age? Linguists studying ancient texts note that many early scripts appear suddenly, with unusual completeness. The Sumerian language has no known precursor. Egyptian writing appears abruptly, fully functional. The Indus script remains undeciphered, but its complexity suggests a long period of development now hidden. If writing arose independently, why does it always appear mature? Perhaps because the societies adopting it were not inventing writing, they were restoring it. Astronomical knowledge offers another clue. Many early cultures understood precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, a cycle spanning nearly 26,000 years. A phenomenon is difficult to observe in less than centuries, yet the Egyptians, the Maya, the Dogon, and others embedded it into their mythologies. Did they observe it themselves, or did they inherit the knowledge from those who lived before the great disruptions? The most delicate possibility, and the hardest to articulate without slipping into conjecture, is that the gods of early cultures were human or near-human survivors of a prior civilization. Not supernaturally powerful, but technologically or intellectually advanced relative to the scattered bands of post-cataclysmic humanity. If a coastal society with complex knowledge systems were destroyed by rising seas, a handful of survivors might have traveled inland, seeking refuge with groups whose worlds had been equally shattered. In such a scenario, the survivors' capabilities, navigation, architecture, astronomy, agriculture, might have appeared miraculous to traumatize populations struggling to rebuild. Over generations, these survivors would become mythologized, their memory elevated into the realm of divinity. Yet even this restrained hypothesis raises lingering questions. If such survivors existed, how many were there? Why do their teachings appear inconsistent, sophisticated in some regions, partial in others? Perhaps because inheritance depends on context. Some groups preserved more, others forgot, others mistranslated. Knowledge passed through human hands changes shape. And then there is the most unsettling question of all. If these teacher figures represented the last echoes of an earlier world, then what happened to the world they came from? And why do the ruins of that world remain so carefully hidden or so thoroughly erased? The ancient myths answer indirectly, with their recurring imagery of water, fire, darkness, and collapse. But myths speak in symbols, not in timelines, and so we are left with their shadows, shadows that tell us only this. Humanity's beginnings were not clean, they were not blank, they were not the birth of something new, but the remembering of something lost. And if the earliest civilizations were rebuilding under the guidance of beings who remembered too much, then the story of our past is not the story we think it is. It is merely the first chapter that survived. There is a peculiar stillness that settles over the study of ancient languages, a quiet that feels different from the silence of ruins or broken monuments. Words are, after all, the most delicate artifacts humanity leaves behind. They erode easily, dissolve into new forms, abandon their original meaning, and migrate across continents disguised as familiar sounds. Yet some languages refuse to behave like the rest. They appear abruptly, already layered with nuance, already carrying concepts that seem too mature for the cultures that first recorded them. It is in the shapes of these words, in the unexpected complexities of their grammar, that the possibility of a forgotten world lingers most stubbornly. Sumerian, for instance, enters the historical record with no ancestral shadow behind it. It is not related to Semitic languages, nor to Indo-European, nor to any known linguistic family. It stands alone, an isolate, arriving not as the first step of experimentation, but as a fully structured system of expression. Its cuneiform signs encode trade, ritual, astronomy, poetry. How does a language emerge suddenly with the ability to record the complexity of a functioning society, unless the society that produced it inherited something older than itself? Egyptian writing presents a similar enigma. The earliest hieroglyphs do not look like tentative marks or rudimentary symbols. They're artistic, standardized, competent. They appear as a language already capable of describing administration, theology, measurement, agriculture. If writing was invented in Egypt, where are the precursor forms? Where are the messy prototypes? Why does the script arrive already in conversation with architecture, mathematics, and cosmology? The Indus script is even more mysterious. It remains undeciphered, but its permutations suggest an underlying grammatical structure. Its brevity, its repetition, and the distribution of its signs imply that it encodes information in a compact and efficient manner. Yet the civilization that used it left no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual text, no direct descendant. It is as though the language belonged to a world that was interrupted, leaving behind only inscriptions carved into stone or pressed into clay, voices speaking a grammar we no longer possess. But perhaps the most provocative example lies in southeastern Europe, where the Turtaria tablets, discovered in modern-day Romania, display symbols that some researchers argue predate Sumerian writing. These signs, etched onto clay, are simple yet organized. They have patterns, sequences, what some believe might be proto-writing. Whether or not they represent a full language is debated, but the implications are enormous. If they are indeed the earliest known symbols of structured communication, then the deep roots of literacy extend far older than conventional models allow, and the epicenter of early writing shifts dramatically. These linguistic anomalies echo one another with uncanny symmetry. They suggest that humanity did not stumble into writing hesitantly, but instead regained it, piecemeal, imperfectly, and in forms that varied from region to region. If a shared ancestral script once existed, it may have been lost in the upheavals at the end of the last ice age. What we see in the historical record, then, are not beginnings but remnants, rewritten scripts of a world whose libraries no longer exist. Linguists sometimes describe language isolates as accidents of survival, languages whose relatives died out due to expansion, assimilation, or cultural collapse. But the sheer number of isolates that appear at the dawn of recorded history suggests a deeper rupture, a linguistic fragmentation consistent with an earlier society shattered by catastrophic events. When a community is dispersed, its vocabulary fractures. When memory becomes oral, grammar simplifies or shifts. When trauma reshapes a people's world, their language adapts defensively, turning old symbols into sacred ones and letting mundane terms vanish. This phenomenon may explain why many early languages carry myths of divine instruction or lost epochs. Words become containers of broken history. The Sumerians wrote of the me, divinely bestowed foundations of knowledge. Egyptians attributed writing to Thoth, who was said to have crafted it in a time before the first kingdoms. The Maya attributed their script to divine scribes. The Dogon claimed that their astronomical terms were given by ancestral teachers. When so many cultures link language to an earlier world, the pattern can no longer be dismissed as coincidence. It becomes evidence of memory, distorted, ritualized, but persistent. Even more unsettling is the fact that certain symbols appear across continents, long before intercultural contact is believed to have occurred. The spiral, the cross, the serpent, the tree, the cup mark. These shapes appear in Neolithic Europe, in the Americas, in Oceania, in Africa, in Asia. They recur in petroglyphs, pottery, megaliths, burial chambers. The universality of these motifs is often explained as psychological archetype or simple geometry. Yet the consistency of their context, associated with cosmology, death, rebirth, time, hints at something older, a shared symbolic vocabulary inherited from a culture that dispersed before recorded history. The question, then, is not merely linguistic. It is civilizational. If early humans shared a symbolic language, what kind of society produced it? And why did its memory collapse so thoroughly that only fragments remain in the scripts of ancient cultures? Some researchers speculate about an early migratory network spanning Eurasia at the end of the Paleolithic, a network capable of transmitting ideas and symbols, but not surviving the climatic upheavals that followed. Others propose that coastal societies, now underwater, might have developed proto-writing and passed it inland only after their worlds drowned. Still others consider the possibility of elite groups or knowledge keepers carrying fragments of older scripts into newly forming societies. But none of these theories answer the deeper question: if language carries memory, what memory was so fragile that the world nearly lost it? Perhaps the answer lies not in the scripts themselves, but in the way they were used. Writing often appears first in ritual, in offerings, in funerary contexts. The earliest tablets from Sumer record not mundane transactions, but ceremonial distributions. Early Egyptian hieroglyphs appear on ivory tags accompanying sacred objects. The Indus script appears frequently on seals associated with trade and identity, forms of social memory. This suggests that writing was not initially a tool of administration, but a tool of preservation, a way of safeguarding knowledge during a time of instability. And if the earlier societies were indeed rebuilding after a global rupture, then writing may have emerged not to innovate, but to remember. A script created not to create bureaucracy, but to cling to the fragments of a world that felt unbearably close to slipping away. This interpretation lends a haunting quality to the earliest inscriptions. They become not the first efforts of human ingenuity, but the last echoes of a world humanity barely survived. And the languages that carry them are not experiments, but inheritances, worn down, fragmented and reshaped through the lens of myth. All of this leads to a final unresolved question, one that lingers at the edge of linguistic study like a shadow. If early languages were the fractured remains of a deeper, older system of knowledge, then what kind of civilization forged that system? And why does its voice reach us only in broken syllables scattered across time? There is a strange feeling that rises whenever one stands before an ancient monument, aligned so precisely to the sky that it seems less a building and more a gesture, an intentional reaching towards something humanity once knew intimately, but gradually forgot. These alignments appear everywhere, in cultures separated by oceans and epochs, and yet they echo one another with an elegance that suggests deliberate inheritance, rather than spontaneous discovery. It is as though the sky itself served as a memory device, a cosmic ledger preserving knowledge too vast to be carried in fragile human words. And in following these alignments, we begin to sense the outline of a worldview both meticulous and mysterious, shared by civilizations that should not, by any conventional history, have shared anything at all. Consider the pyramids of Giza. Their axes align with astonishing accuracy to the cardinal directions, so accurately, in fact, that the margin of error rivals what modern instruments can achieve. Their placement mirrors the stars of Orion's belt as they appeared in the sky, thousands of years before Egypt's Old Kingdom. Whether this was intentional is debated, but the alignment is undeniable. The monuments converse with the heavens. Some Egyptologists suggest that these orientations arose from religious symbolism. Perhaps, but why should a spiritual belief require such mathematical precision? Why should a society at the supposed dawn of a large-scale architecture possess an understanding of stellar movement that requires generations of careful observation? Further west, in the British Isles, the stones of Stonehenge perform a similar astronomical choreography. The monument's axis aligns with a midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset. The arrangement of its stones suggests knowledge not only of solar cycles but also of lunar periodicities. To track the 18.6-year lunar nodal cycle requires long-term observational discipline, a patient, methodical engagement with the sky across decades. Yet Stonehenge's builders left no written record. How then did they preserve this knowledge? Where did it originate? Was it discovered independently? Or does it hint at traditions reaching back to a more ancient, pre-literate world? Traveling south to Malta, one finds the Mnaistra temple complex aligned so precisely with equinox and solstice sunrises that the light enters its chambers like a blade, illuminating specific stones with ceremonial intention. The hypogeum beneath Malta, an underground labyrinth, resonates at 110 Hz, a frequency that affects human cognition and perception. Whether accidental or deliberate, such properties imply a sophisticated understanding not only of stone and space, but of the relationship between human experience and environmental design. These structures seem less like temples and more like instruments: celestial, acoustic, mnemonic. In South America, the city of Teotihuacan is laid out according to a grid aligned roughly 15.5 degrees east of north. This orientation corresponds to astronomical events and may encode information about the movements of the Pleiades, a star cluster central to Mesoamerican cosmology. The Pyramid of the Sun is aligned to the setting sun on specific dates, marking agricultural cycles. The builders understood the sky as a rhythmic partner to the earth, a clock whose movements determine survival. But the more puzzling question is how a civilization with no written astronomical records, at least none that survive, produced such a coherent celestial architecture. In Cambodia, Angkor Wat reveals another layer of this global pattern. Its towers mirror the arrangement of the constellation Draco at a particular point in time. Its entire complex is an astronomical diagram, encoding solstices, equinoxes, and lunar cycles. The sophistication of this layout suggests not only observational astronomy, but inherited tradition. Knowledge passed through ritual, architecture, and myth. Across continents, across millennia, the same motifs repeat: alignments to solstices, to equinoxes, to lunar nodes, to specific stars that mark cosmological ages. These ancient architectures share a cosmological grammar, as though humanity once moved through time with a unified sense of the sky's significance. Modern scholarship often partitions these alignments into categories: ritual, symbolic, agricultural. But such explanations miss the deeper implication. To orient a building toward the horizon is simple. To align vast complexes with precision is not. It requires stable long-term observation, coordinated effort, and cultural continuity. Such continuity is difficult to maintain through periods of upheaval, unless the knowledge predates the upheaval. Perhaps this is why so many early civilizations describe a first time, a golden age when the gods taught humanity the structure of the cosmos. In Egypt, this was Zep Tepi, the first occasion when the world was measured and order imposed. In Mesoamerica, cycles of world creation and destruction emphasize the resetting of cosmic time. In India, the yugas describe epochs of rising and falling knowledge, each separated by turmoil. These myths might not describe literal divine intervention, but rather the memory of a lost astronomical tradition, one established before cataclysm forced humanity into cultural fragmentation. Scholars sometimes dismiss the alignments as coincidences or the result of cultural convergence. After all, every society watches the sunrise. Every society tracks seasons, but not every society encodes precessional knowledge, that slow shift in the Earth's axis that alters the position of stars over thousands of years. Precession is not obvious. It is not visible within a human lifetime. Yet the ancients encoded it everywhere, in the Maya long count calendar, in the Hindu concept of cosmic ages, in the alignment of monuments whose stellar targets correspond to epochs far older than the structures themselves. Were these societies tracking precession consciously? Or were they inheriting a tradition established by people who had begun those observations long before the surviving cultures existed? The idea does not require anything supernatural, only the possibility that a pre-flood or late Ice Age society possessed observational continuity and a stable enough social structure to record celestial cycles. If such a society lived along coastlines now underwater, its observational monuments, observational platforms, and astronomical records may lie beneath the sea, unseen, unexcavated, and unimagined. This possibility casts the ancient alignments in a new light. They become not inventions, but restorations, attempts to align the new world with the rhythms of the old, after catastrophe, after displacement, after the loss of ancestral homelands. People rebuilt, and in rebuilding they reached for the sky, perhaps because the sky was the only constant left. Yet one mystery remains. Why was this astronomical architecture abandoned? Why did later civilizations forget the very principles their ancestors encoded in stone? Why did alignment-based construction disappear, replaced by styles that no longer mirrored the cosmos? Perhaps because the knowledge keepers vanished. Perhaps because the lineages that preserved celestial understanding fragmented beyond repair. Or perhaps because the world itself changed so profoundly that the memory of the earlier cycles no longer held meaning. What is undeniable is this. Wherever the earliest monumental architectures rise, the sky is present, quietly, precisely, insistently. The alignments speak not in language, but in geometry, in angles, in the long arcs of stars. And they leave us with a question as wide and silent as the night itself. If these structures were attempts to remember the sky as it once was, then what kind of civilization first taught humanity to measure time not in seasons, but in the movements of eternity? Some places in the ancient world do not simply stand in silence, they vibrate with it. They hold a frequency, a resonance, a hum that seems to originate not from the stones themselves, but from something the stones are remembering. And when one enters these spaces, it becomes impossible to ignore the impression that they were crafted not merely to endure, but to speak. Yet what they speak is not in human language. It is vibration, echo, tone, a form of communication older than writing and perhaps older than civilization itself. If earlier parts of this journey hinted at knowledge passed through architecture and myth, then these acoustic chambers unveil a new dimension of forgotten memory, knowledge carried through sound. Deep beneath Malta, the hypogeum of Halsaflieni coils through limestone like an engineered cavern from some vanished era. Its chambers are small, curved, intimate, yet the acoustics within them are shockingly deliberate. In one room of the so-called oracle chamber, a voice at even a whisper resonates at exactly 110 hertz, a frequency known to influence human cognition and perception. Modern experiments show that tones at this frequency can induce trance-like states, heighten awareness, or create the sensation of presence. How could Neolithic people, without metallurgy, without written treatises, carve such a chamber with such acoustic precision? Or, more provocatively, why would they? The hippodrome's builders left no texts explaining their intentions, but the space suggests purpose. Bones discovered there belonged to thousands of individuals, hinting at ritual use. Its walls bear symbols found nowhere else on the island. Its geometry defies coincidence. The resonance seems engineered not for the living alone, but for the dead, for memory, for some boundary between worlds. And yet this site is not unique. Across the globe, other ancient structures behave like tuning forks for the human soul. At Chavinda in Peru, underground galleries amplify the roar of conch shell trumpets until the sound seems to come from everywhere at once. The effect is disorienting, transformative. Visitors in modern experiments describe losing their sense of direction, self and physical orientation. The architecture manipulates sound with geometric precision, creating an environment designed to alter consciousness. And once again, no written explanations survive. In Ireland, the chamber at Newgrange, 5,000 years old, captures different kind of resonance. When one sings within its stone interior, certain notes linger unnaturally, filling the chamber as if the walls themselves are singing back. And once each year during the winter solstice, A thin beam of sunlight shoots down the passage, illuminating the inner chamber in a golden glow. Light and sound converge in a single moment, an acoustic sunrise engineered long before recorded history. Göbekli Tepe, though not enclosed, reveals similar acoustic sensitivities. Tests indicate that the stone enclosures amplify voices and chants, creating a rhythmic feedback that would have enveloped gatherings in a sonic field. The pillars, carved with animals and symbols, may have served not only visual and ritual functions, but acoustic ones. The site feels like a theater for cosmological performance, a place where myth, sky, and vibration converged. Why then did these early cultures devote such extraordinary effort to the manipulation of sound? The answer may lie in the nature of pre-literate societies. Before writing, knowledge traveled through speech, rhythm, repetition. Sacred teachings were sung, origins were chanted. Memory relied not on tablets, but on vibration. And if a society wished to preserve memory, especially memory inherited from an earlier world, sound would have been one of its most powerful tools. But there is another possibility, one more elusive and unsettling. Ancient societies may have understood sound not merely as communication, but as a force. Many early myths speak of creation through vibration. The Om of the Vedas, the word in the Hebrew tradition, the song lines of Aboriginal Australia. Even scientific inquiry reveals that sound can shape matter, generating geometric patterns in sand or water, cymatics reflecting the hidden order of vibration. If ancient cultures recognized this, then acoustic chambers were not merely ritual spaces, they were instruments, tools for invoking, remembering, or aligning with forces deeper than language. Some archaeologists suggest that the resonant qualities of these sites were accidental, yet the consistency across regions, Malta, Peru, Ireland, Turkey, suggests intent, not chance. These structures reflect a worldview in which architecture and sound were inseparable, each enhancing the other. They also hint at a kind of knowledge difficult to preserve after catastrophe. While stones endure, traditions of sound are fragile. They require mentors, apprentices, rituals, systems easily disrupted by migration, climate change, or cultural upheaval. If the world shattered at the end of the Ice Age, the acoustic knowledge that shaped these monuments may have been among the first casualties. The loss is visible in the record. Later structures lack the same sonic sophistication. The Hypogeum stands alone on Malta. No later temple imitates its resonance. The acoustic properties of Chavin are not preserved in Inca designs. Newgrange's luminous soundscape is not mirrored in later Irish monuments. It is as though the knowledge faded, gradually, unevenly, until only the stones remembered it. This pattern mirrors what we have seen with language, astronomy, and architecture. Sudden brilliance followed by decline or simplification. The earliest examples are often the most advanced, as if inherited from a world already mature, already practiced in its arts, already fluent in knowledge we've forgotten. And beneath this pattern lies a deeper question. Sound is not merely vibration, it is time made audible. It is movement through air, through stone, through the body. It is ephemeral, yet powerful, in a world rebuilding after catastrophe, where memory is fragile and continuity fractured. Could sound have served as a bridge between the lost world and the new? Could resonant spaces have been sanctuaries for remembering, not intellectually, but experientially? What words could no longer convey? The thought lingers like a low hum, that these chambers were not built to amplify the human voice, but to remind it, to carry fragments of forgotten cosmologies through ritual, to awaken memories encoded not in writing but in perception. But if such knowledge existed, where did it originate? How did it survive long enough to inspire construction on multiple continents? And why did it disappear so thoroughly that modern cultures see only the stones and not the frequencies that animated them? Perhaps the builders were inheritors of a tradition older than catastrophe, keepers of techniques passed down through generations, who understood the world not as a collection of objects, but as a field of resonance. Perhaps they preserved what little they could in stone chambers before the last bearers of the tradition vanished. Or perhaps the loss was more sudden, a disaster that scattered the knowledge keepers, leaving only incomplete echoes to be rebuilt imperfectly by later societies. Whatever the cause, the result is unmistakable. The oldest structures on Earth seem to speak through vibration, as though transmitting a message left by those who did not trust words to survive the coming darkness. And the question these chambers leave behind, vibrating quietly even after the sound fades, is this: if ancient people built monuments that could speak, then what knowledge were they trying to make the stones remember? When their own voices could no longer carry it forward, there is a particular kind of silence that hangs over the most remote parts of the planet. A silence so vast and unmoving that it feels less like emptiness and more like refusal. Antarctica's frozen deserts, the drowned plains of the Indian Ocean, the vanished coasts of the Americas, the shifting sands of the Sahara. These are not simply places where history is absent. They are places where history is hiding. And when one considers how much of early humanity's story lies buried under ice, water, and sand, the timeline we cling to begins to feel small, almost fragile, as though we are reading only the epilogue of a far longer book, whose earlier chapters are sealed away by the planet itself. Few environments evoke this feeling more strongly than Antarctica. Beneath its miles-thick ice lies a continent twice the size of Australia, a landmass that once hosted rivers, forests, lakes, and possibly even megafauna. Recent surveys using radar and satellite imaging have revealed mountain ranges, valleys, and vast subglacial lakes. Some scientists suggest that parts of the continent were ice-free as recently as 6,000 years ago, long after the end of the last ice age, due to shifts in Earth's axial tilt and regional climate. If true, this would mean that early humans could have encountered an Antarctica drastically different from the desolate expanse we know today. And if humans ever reached it, what traces would remain under such a crushing, shifting tomb of ice? But Antarctica is only one of many places where memory lies beneath a barrier. Consider Doggerland, the now submerged land that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. During the last ice age, it was a fertile region with rivers, lakes, forests, and human settlements. As sea levels rose, Doggerland drowned, piece by piece, until all that remained were the British Isles. Fishermen still pull up artifacts, tools, bones, fragments of hearths, caught in their nets. The region was not a barren wasteland. It was a thriving center of human life. Its disappearance erases not only physical evidence, but the context that would help explain the sudden developments in Neolithic Europe. It is a reminder that our history sits atop an ocean that swallowed vast portions of its own beginning. Off the coast of India, the waters near Dwarka and the Gulf of Kambat conceal structures that some researchers believe may be remnants of ancient settlements, lost to catastrophic flooding. Patterns resembling foundations, walls, and streets have appeared in sonar scans. If confirmed, these submerged features could date back to periods predating known urban centers in the region. Even if natural formations account for part of what has been seen, the very possibility highlights an unavoidable truth. Entire civilizations could lie drowned along continental shelves beyond the reach of excavation. The same is true around Japan, where the Yonaguni underwater terrace continues to provoke debate, whether natural or modified, its geometric appearance, staircases, platforms, right angles, suggests the possibility of human involvement at a time when rising seas erased shorelines across East Asia. If coastal populations constructed anything there, it now lies beneath the waves. And then there is the Sahara. Today, it is an expanse of sand stretching from horizon to horizon, but it was not always so. Ancient lakes once filled its basins. Rivers carved winding paths across what is now barren dust. The remnants of stone structures, petroglyphs and lost cities peek from beneath dunes after storms. But most of what existed during the African humid period, when the Sahara bloomed with vegetation and supported pastoral cultures, is now buried. Satellite imagery has revealed outlines of forgotten settlements, roads, even possible megalithic sites. But the sand keeps its secrets well. To excavate the entire desert would take centuries. What these regions share is not merely obscurity, but inaccessibility. The Earth has sealed them behind natural barriers, ice that fractures equipment, oceans that hide depths too expensive to survey exhaustively, sand that shifts unpredictably and erases its own footsteps. The story of humanity may be hidden not in isolated anomalies, but in vast landscapes we cannot realistically explore. And amid this physical inaccessibility lies an intellectual one. Academia understandably prefers what can be documented, measured, reproduced. But what happens when the majority of evidence for an early epoch of human complexity lies in places that cannot be excavated? Our models become constrained not by truth, but by what is available, by land that remained above sea level, by regions spared from glaciers, by terrain accessible to excavation. The result is a history that looks linear, localized, gradual, because the parts that would complicate that narrative lie beyond reach. In this light, the sudden emergence of sophisticated societies after the Ice Age does not appear as a miraculous leap. It appears as the visible tip of something much larger, the surviving fragment of a world mostly lost to natural forces. Civilizations rise when geography allows them to. When geographical continuity collapses, so does cultural continuity. If coastal populations with advanced traditions were displaced by rising seas, their knowledge would scatter. Some fragments might survive inland, becoming the seeds of later societies. Others would vanish entirely. This scattering could explain why early civilizations emerge abruptly, with mature techniques that seem to lack local developmental trajectories. But the question deepens when one considers how these inaccessible regions align with ancient myths. Many societies describe lands lost to water, to ice, to shifting deserts. The Greeks spoke of islands swallowed by the sea. Indigenous Australians recall coastlines that no longer exist. The Maya recount floods that consumed earlier worlds. Even the Egyptians spoke of Zep Tepi, a time before the desert reclaimed the land. These myths, long dismissed as symbolic, begin to sound like echoes of real geological transformations. Antarctica, for example, appears in ancient maps like the Piri Reis chart, not accurately, but strangely, as if fragments of older cartographic knowledge survived in medieval sources. Scholars debate the interpretations, but the persistence of such imagery raises questions about how ancient navigators conceptualized the world. Could memories of ice-free southern lands have survived in oral traditions far older than the manuscripts that recorded them? The Sahara's transformation from savanna to desert mirrors stories of lands cursed or abandoned. Submerged coasts echo tales of kingdoms lost beneath the waves. When myths from cultures separated by oceans all recall landscapes dramatically altered by water or sand, the possibility of shared geological memory becomes difficult to ignore. Yet, for all these parallels, the greatest mystery is not what was lost, but why no clear record of the preceding world survives. How could entire continents' worth of human activity vanish? The answer may be simpler than it appears. Human memory is fragile. Oral traditions can persist for thousands of years, but physical artifacts cannot survive ice sheets grinding them to dust, or oceans dissolving their structures, or sand burying them beyond reach. The Earth is an efficient eraser, but even erasers leave smudges, and it is those smudges, enigmatic alignments, anomalous artifacts, languages without origins, myths of teachers and floods, that imply an earlier chapter waiting to be uncovered. All of this leads to a deeper, more unsettled question that hovers at the edge of our understanding. If the Earth itself conceals so much of humanity's earlier story, then how much of our past do we truly know? And how much remains entombed in places we were never meant to see again? There is a subtle unease that forms when one studies the sky the way ancient people did, not with telescopes or equations, but with patience, repetition, and a sense of reverence. The deeper you look, the more you begin to sense that the earliest civilizations knew far more about the heavens than their supposed technological level should have allowed. Their calendars stretch for thousands of years, their myths encode the movements of invisible stars, their monuments mirror constellations that shift slowly across epochs. And everywhere the same question emerges: how did they know these things, unless the knowledge was older than the civilizations themselves? Take precession, the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis, which causes the position of stars to drift over a cycle of nearly 26,000 years. It is not something one can observe in a lifetime. To identify precession, you need centuries of continuous observation, recorded with precision and interpreted across generations. Yet the concept appears implicitly in multiple ancient traditions. The Egyptians encoded stellar cycles in their temple alignments, some of which point not to the sky of their own era, but to skies of much earlier epochs. The Dendera zodiac depicts constellations arranged in a manner suggesting awareness of long-term celestial shifts. The so-called Sothic cycles, connected to the rising of Sirius, hint at an understanding of astronomical rhythms spanning thousands of years. Egyptologists debate the extent of this knowledge, but the monuments themselves carry the quiet implication that someone, not necessarily the Egyptians of the dynastic age, but someone before them, had already begun observing the heavens long enough to discern patterns beyond the span of human memory. In Mesoamerica, the Maya tracked celestial cycles with a sophistication that still astonishes scholars. Their long-count calendar spans tens of thousands of years. Their astronomical records chart the movements of Venus to within fractions of a day. Some steely reference sky cycles so vast that the Maya could not have observed them directly. Their knowledge did not begin in their era, it was inherited. The question is, from whom? In the Dogon region of Mali, ethnographers in the 20th century recorded an oral tradition describing the star system of Sirius, including the existence of Sirius B, a white dwarf invisible to the naked eye, and discovered by Western astronomy only with the help of advanced telescopes. The Dogon also described Sirius C, whose existence remains debated. Skeptics have proposed alternative explanations, but the specificity of the Dogon cosmology continues to provoke curiosity. How did a non-literate agrarian society acquire detailed knowledge of a star invisible to human eyes? Where did this fragment of astronomical memory originate? And then there are the Nazca lines in Peru, massive geoglyphs stretching across desert plains, some of which align with solstices, star rises, and horizon markers. Their full patterns can only be seen from above. While their exact purpose remains unknown, the knowledge embedded in their orientation suggests a deep relationship between land and sky, one that required both mathematical planning and long-term observation. The same pattern emerges again in Polynesia. Navigators use the night sky to journey thousands of miles across open ocean, relying on star paths, wave patterns, and subtle environmental cues. Their knowledge was not written but memorized, an oral system of astonishing complexity. Some legends describe ancestors arriving from distant lands guided by star beings, or teachers who understood the sky in ways modern observers still struggle to replicate. This knowledge, too, appears as an inheritance rather than an invention. If these examples existed in isolation, they could be dismissed as cultural exceptions. But taken together across continents, they suggest something larger, a global memory of the sky. A recognition that humanity's earliest teachers may have been the heavens themselves, or individuals who understood the heavens so deeply that their knowledge outlived their civilizations. But precession and star cycles are only part of the mystery. Consider the alignment of monuments to specific stars at specific times. The pyramids of Giza align not to the sky of their construction era, but to the sky of thousands of years earlier, matching the belt stars of Orion as they appeared around 10,500 BCE. Whether intentional or coincidental, the implication is troubling. Why would a culture encode a celestial pattern associated with a date long preceding its known history? Similarly, the structures at Nubta Playa in southern Egypt, stone circles dating to around 7,000 BCE, contain astronomical alignments that may encode knowledge of solstices and star positions. These alignments predate dynastic Egypt by millennia. They suggest that people inhabiting the Sahara long before it became a desert possessed astronomical awareness that should have been beyond their reach. In India, ancient Sanskrit texts describe cosmic cycles so vast that they make modern scientific timescales feel modest. The durations of the yugas, ages of the world, span millions of years. Some scholars dismiss these numbers as symbolic, yet they also encode rhythms of precession and planetary cycles. Were these cycles invented by later thinkers, or transmitted from a much older tradition that observed the sky across ages? One possibility is that ancient observers simply paid closer attention, accumulating knowledge slowly and carefully. But this explanation falters when faced with the scope of what they recorded. To detect a precessional shift of 1 degree requires 72 years of continuous observation. To detect the entire cycle requires millennia. No single culture in its documented form lasted long enough to observe it fully. And yet the knowledge exists in myth, in architecture, in calendars, in symbols. This leads to the alternative hypothesis. The knowledge was inherited from a populational culture that existed before the documented rise of civilizations, one with continuity of observation, stability of tradition, and a worldview anchored in the sky. If such a culture existed along ancient coastlines, now submerged, its observatories, records, and instruments would lie underwater, erased by rising seas. What remains on land would be fragments carried inland by survivors. This hypothesis, though provocative, aligns with the archaeological pattern. Humanity after the Ice Age appears not as a blank slate, but as a people remembering, a people rebuilding, a people with flashes of knowledge disconnected from local developmental pathways. The sky becomes the last fragile connection. Stars move predictably. Their rhythms remain unchanged even when landscapes drown and societies collapse. For a civilization emerging from catastrophe, the sky would be the one stable reference, a cosmic anchor to recover orientation, not just in space, but in time. Yet even as ancient societies encoded the heavens into stone, many of these traditions eventually faded. Later generations inherited the monuments but not the meaning. Pre-discarded fragments, astronomers interpreted symbols without understanding their origins. Over centuries, inherited knowledge became ritualized, then mythologized, then lost. Which raises the most haunting question of all. If ancient people possessed astronomical knowledge that seems older than their civilizations, then who first observed the sky long enough to understand these cycles, and why did their memory dissolve while their influence remained? There is a quiet vertigo that comes from contemplating the past not as a straight line, but as a cycle, an endless turning of rise and collapse, illumination and forgetting. The more one studies the earliest layers of human history, the more linear time begins to feel like an illusion created by our short-lived perspective. Civilizations do not simply appear, grow, and decline. They repeat themselves, often with eerie familiarity. They climb toward complexity only to shatter into fragments that drift into the next age like seeds searching for new soil. And when these fragments blossom again, we call them discoveries. unaware that we're witnessing the return of something older, something once buried beneath catastrophe. Many ancient cultures anchored their worldviews in cycles. The Vedic tradition described the yugas, vast epochs of rising and falling knowledge. The Greeks spoke of ages of gold, silver, bronze, and darkness. The Maya envisioned previous worlds destroyed and renewed through fire and water. Even Plato hinted that humanity forgets itself through periodic cataclysms, like a child forced to relearn wisdom after each cosmic reset. These were not metaphors for seasonal change. They were attempts to articulate a pattern, that civilization is not a singular ascent but a heartbeat. Modern archaeology, though cautious, sometimes echoes this ancient intuition. The archaeological record reveals moments when human development appears to surge forward, followed by periods of stagnation or collapse. The end of the Younger Dryas, marked by abrupt climate change, coincides with a sudden flowering of monumental architecture. The Late Bronze Age collapse, in which nearly every major Mediterranean civilization fell within decades, erased technologies and trade networks that took centuries to build. The fall of the Roman Empire plunged Europe into a fragmentation that required a millennium to repair. Each time, knowledge contracted, then re-emerged in altered form. But the most provocative question is whether this cyclical pattern extends far beyond the boundaries of recorded history. Did earlier cycles exist, cycles now obscured by sea level rise, shifting deserts, volcanic eruptions, and ice? If humanity reached significant levels of organization before the last glacial melt, their cities would lie beneath the ocean. Their archives would be erased. Their monuments might survive only as scattered, anomalous artifacts on hilltops that escaped the flood. This would explain why the earliest known civilizations appear suddenly sophisticated. It would explain why languages, astronomy, agriculture, and architecture emerged not as clumsy prototypes, but as confident expressions of inherited knowledge. It would explain why myths remember teachers from earlier ages, and why so many traditions insist that humanity is not living in its first world, but its latest recovery. The concept of cyclical time reshapes everything. If civilization has risen and fallen before, then what we call ancient may be only the first visible layer of a much older strata. The deepest layers, those belonging to pre-flood societies, would be missing. Not because they never existed, but because time, water, and earth have hidden them. Consider the peculiar gaps in human development. Between 70,000 and 12,000 years ago, Homo sapiens spread across the globe. They created art, tools, boats, musical instruments. They navigated vast distances, and yet, according to conventional history, they did not build cities, write languages, or erect monuments. Why the long plateau, followed by a sudden burst of civilization? Is this truly a plateau, or the aftermath of a cycle in which earlier societies were erased and humanity was forced to rebuild from scattered remnants? Genetic studies add to the puzzle. Evidence of population bottlenecks suggests humanity may have shrunk dramatically at multiple points, possibly due to volcanic eruptions, climate instability, or other unknown pressures. Such events could have destroyed earlier cultural centers, forcing survivors to rebuild with whatever fragments they carried. If each cycle erased much of the world's knowledge, the pattern of sudden advancements followed by mysterious stalls makes sense. Memory would fade, skills would be lost, only myths, compressed, symbolic, would survive long enough to seed the next cycle. Some researchers propose that knowledge behaves like an ecosystem. It expands when conditions are stable, when populations grow, when food is abundant, when trade networks flourish. But when conditions collapse, knowledge contracts. It becomes tribal, secretive, or ritualistic. It hides in temples, in caves, in symbols carved into stone. And when stability returns, knowledge expands again, sometimes rapidly as if relieved to breathe. This dynamic is cyclical, not linear. It mirrors the rise and fall of civilizations. It mirrors the Earth's climate cycles. It mirrors the movement of stars. In this sense, the ancient myths of recurring ages may not describe divine intervention, but environmental reality. The Earth itself moves in cycles, glacial periods, orbital shifts, solar variations. These inexorable rhythms impose patterns on culture. Civilizations bloom in warm, stable eras and collapse in cold or chaotic ones. Knowledge stored in fragile mediums, wood, cloth, oral tradition, disappears with each contraction. Only stone persists, only myth endures. And where myth endures, it whispers. It whispers of worlds lost to water. It whispers of teachers returning after darkness. It whispers of knowledge that burns too brightly to be preserved by ordinary minds. But it also whispers of warning. Civilizations that believed themselves eternal vanished with startling speed. The Minoans, the Maya, the Akkadians, the people of Göbekli Tepe, all succumbed not to technological inferiority, but to environmental or social rupture. They rose, reached complexity, and fell. Their ruins remain as quiet reminders that stability is temporary, that knowledge is fragile, and that humanity is always living beside the possibility of forgetting. In this context, the sudden brilliance of early civilizations becomes less mysterious. If they were emerging from the ashes of an earlier cycle, their achievements would reflect memory, not novelty. And their myths, of gods who taught writing, of sages who restored the calendar, of architects who remembered the sky, would represent encoded history, not fanciful allegory. This cyclical understanding also reframes the apparent gaps in our timeline. Missing cultural layers may not indicate absence, they may indicate erasure. The soil accumulates slowly, the sea erases quickly. A cataclysm can destroy more in a few years than an archaeologist can uncover in a lifetime. And so, when we look backward and see only darkness, it may be because the cycle before ours ended abruptly. But the deepest question remains, if humanity passes through cycles, if knowledge rises and falls like tides, then are we living in the aftermath of just one such cycle or many? How old is our species truly? Not biologically, but culturally. How many times have we risen? How many times have we fallen? How many times have we forgotten ourselves? The ancient world offers hints but no certainty. It offers patterns but not causes. It offers echoes but not voices. And so we are left with a question that lingers with quiet insistence, as all great questions do. If civilization moves in cycles, then what marks the boundary between one age and the next? And how close are we right now to crossing that boundary again? There is a peculiar heaviness that gathers around certain pieces of information, an atmospheric pressure that forms not because the knowledge is false, but because it is inconvenient. Throughout history, societies have repeatedly drawn invisible boundaries around what may be questioned, what may be remembered, and what must remain in shadow. Sometimes this boundary protects power, sometimes it protects belief, sometimes it protects the delicate structure of a narrative that would crumble if too many threads were pulled loose. And it is at the edges of these boundaries where evidence becomes blurry, where interpretations become contested, that the most dangerous knowledge tends to reside. It is not dangerous because it threatens stability in the present. It is dangerous because it threatens the stories we tell about the past. Consider ancient mining operations. In South Africa's Mpumalanga region, thousands of circular structures dot the landscape, stone ruins whose age remains intensely debated. Some researchers propose dates stretching tens of thousands of years, citing geological and astronomical indicators. Others insist on a far younger origin. Scattered iron and copper mines in the region add fuel to the controversy. If any of these structures predate conventional timelines, they would challenge the assumption that early humans lacked organized, large-scale industry. But the debate rarely enters mainstream discourse. It is easier, perhaps, to leave the question suspended in a fog of academic caution than to confront what such ruins might imply. Then there are the anomalies found in caves and deep earth strata, objects whose placement appears to contradict their context, hammer-like tools embedded in rock layers older than expected, metallic spheres with grooves that appear artificial. These objects generate a peculiar discomfort. For every attempt to dismiss them as natural formations or intrusive contamination, another question arises: why do such artifacts cluster disproportionately in layers associated with geological upheaval? Why do they so often sit at the margins of what the conventional timeline allows? The impulse to categorize them as accidents of nature may be less about scientific rigor and more about narrative preservation. To entertain the possibility of older technological activity, even hypothetically, is to risk unraveling the linear model of human development. Genetics offers its own quiet provocations. Certain lineages, such as haplogroup X2, appear in geographically disconnected populations, Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas, long before the migrations used to explain their distribution. Mitochondrial DNA reveals bottlenecks suggestive of ancient population catastrophes, yet also unexpected bursts of diversity hinting at expansions from sources unknown. These genetic puzzles are rarely discussed outside specialized fields, not because they lack significance, but because they complicate the tidy migratory maps that populate textbooks. They suggest movements, interactions, and extinctions far older and more intricate than the simplified arcs we're taught. Even artifacts from recognized civilizations sometimes carry details that slip uneasily into accepted frameworks. The Baghdad battery, though likely not a true battery, still raises questions about experimental knowledge in antiquity. The Antikythera mechanism, once dismissed as impossible for its time, forced historians to reconsider the technological capabilities of ancient Greece. But for every well-known anomaly that eventually finds a place in the academic story, dozens remain sidelined in museum basements, catalogued but uncontextualized because they resist easy classification. They are inconvenient not as objects, but as implications. And then there is the matter of suppressed or selective translation. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists frequently filtered ancient texts through culturally comfortable interpretations. When Sumerian tablets describe kings ruling for thousands of years, translators labeled these as symbolic exaggerations. When Egyptian records spoke of epochs before the dynastic age, such references were quietly reclassified as myth. Even Plato's account of Atlantis, though written as a historical recollection conveyed by priests, was relegated to allegory. To question these interpretations is not to claim literal truth, but to acknowledge that our reading of the past has long been shaped by biases, by what we deem plausible rather than by what ancient cultures actually stated. Why then does this discomfort persist? Why does humanity resist the possibility that our ancestors may have inherited fragments of a deeper past? Perhaps because the modern worldview depends on a sense of progress, a belief that humanity has risen steadily from ignorance toward enlightenment. This narrative gives meaning to innovation, structure to history, identity to civilization. But if earlier cycles reached heights comparable to, or even exceeding those of later societies, then progress becomes less linear and more fragile. It becomes a rhythm punctuated by forgetting, and forgetting is unsettling. Power structures, too, have incentives to control narratives of origin. Religious institutions often anchor their doctrines in specific timelines. Empires justify their authority by framing themselves as the inheritors of civilization. Academia, for all its commitment to inquiry, relies on consensus frameworks to maintain coherence across fields. To destabilize foundational assumptions is to risk destabilizing the entire structure. Thus, certain topics become dangerous, not because they are conspiratorial, but because they are disruptive. But danger does not always come from institutions. It also comes from fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of uncertainty. Fear of the possibility that human history is not a clean ascent but a maze of rises, collapses, and forgotten ages. To imagine lost civilizations is not to indulge fantasy. It is to confront the fragility of memory. It is to acknowledge that human achievement can vanish, that knowledge can burn, that entire worlds can sink beneath the sea. Such recognition forces us to see our present not as the pinnacle of progress, but as one precarious moment in a long, cyclical story. The dangerous knowledge of the ancient world, then, is not any single artifact, ruin, or text. It is the accumulation of anomalies, the steady drip of contradictions that challenge a narrative too small to contain them. A copper mine older than expected, a star map encoded in myth, a language without ancestors, a monument aligned to an epoch its builders could not have observed, a submerged city found where no city should be. Individually, these anomalies can be dismissed. Collectively, they form a shadow, an outline, of something larger, something that once existed and was erased, or fragmented, or buried beneath millennia of earth and ocean. Something that early civilizations remembered imperfectly, turning to myth not because they lacked imagination, but because myth was the last vessel capable of carrying what remained. What makes such knowledge dangerous is not that it is forbidden, but that it is transformative. To acknowledge it is to recognize that the human story is older, stranger, and more cyclical than our current frameworks allow. It invites questions that cannot be confined to one discipline. Questions about astronomy, geology, genetics, linguistics, mythology. Questions about continuity and rupture. Questions about memory and loss. And at the heart of these questions lies a quiet, persistent possibility. If humanity has forgotten parts of its past, not by neglect, but through catastrophe and curation, then how much of what we call ancient is merely the surviving edge of a far older tapestry? And what truths lie just beyond our reach, waiting for a moment when the world becomes ready or willing to remember them again? There are moments in the study of ancient history when the evidence does not point to a conclusion, but to an absence, a strange echoing void that feels less like something missing and more like something deliberately withdrawn. It is in these moments that the idea of a predecessor civilization, not mythic but human, begins to take shape, not as a fully formed theory nor as a definitive narrative, but as an outline, a faint silhouette behind the earliest known cultures. The silhouette is not built from fantasy. It emerges from patterns, anomalies too widespread to be coincidence, echoes too consistent to be illusion, memories too persistent to be mere imagination. And as each part of this journey has shown, when civilizations separated by oceans record similar events, build with similar methods, or encode similar cosmic principles, the possibility of shared inheritance becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. This sense of an older presence is most vivid in the places where cultures abruptly bloom. Consider the Sumerians, who emerged with a sophistication that feels out of step with their place in the archaeological timeline. Their earlier city-states display complex irrigation, mathematics, astronomy, and legal structure. Their writing system appears suddenly, without the expected evolutionary trajectory from pictograph to script. Their myths do not describe invention, they describe restoration. When they speak of being taught by the Upkalu after a great flood, they are not sketching gods, they are recalling memory. Similarly, in Egypt, the earliest dynasties inherit architectural, symbolic, and astronomical knowledge so refined that scholars still debate its origins. The precision of early Egyptian engineering declines, not increases, as centuries progress. The oldest pyramids are the most mathematically perfect. The earliest texts are the most cosmologically rich. Like Sumer, Egypt feels less like a beginning and more like the end of a longer hidden lineage. In the Andes, the story repeats. The oldest stonework at sites like Sacsayhuaman and Machu Picchu is the most precise, while later additions are cruder. Oral tradition attributes the earliest works not to the Inca, but to forgotten people who came long before. The Inca did not claim to have built the Cyclopean foundations, they claimed to have found them. In Polynesia, navigational knowledge appears so advanced that even modern sailors struggle to understand how it emerged without written tools. The Lapita people navigated thousands of miles of open ocean with accuracy that defies gradual development. Their myths, like those of early American and Eurasian cultures, speak of earlier journeys, lost islands, and ancestral teachers who guided migrations after great upheavals. These patterns form a quiet chorus. Each voice sings a different melody, but all harmonize around the same refrain. Something older existed, and parts of it survived. What makes this notion so difficult to articulate is that there is no singular, monolithic, lost civilization waiting to be named. Instead, the evidence suggests a mosaic, a network of cultures, perhaps coastal, perhaps global in reach, whose knowledge flowed into the world we recognize today. A world disrupted by rising seas, by climate shifts, by the collapse of ecosystems. A world in which survivors retreated inland, carrying fragments of memory that would eventually become the myths, symbols, and rituals of later civilizations. Thus, the question is not whether such a predecessor existed. The question is what form it took. Some researchers imagine a maritime society, one whose settlements lined ancient coastlines, now submerged beneath hundreds of meters of water. Others propose a network of advanced hunter-gatherer populations whose observational skills, astronomical, ecological, architectural, far exceeded what we typically attribute to Paleolithic humans. Still others suggest a hybrid model, small but specialized groups of knowledge keepers spread across continents who preserved fragments of pre-cataclysm knowledge. What these hypotheses share is not certainty but humility. The humility to acknowledge that our archaeological lens is narrow. 90% of the world's earliest human habitation likely lies underwater, beneath deserts, or buried under layers of sediment unreachable by current technology. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, it is evidence of geological erasure. The more compelling evidence is cultural, not physical. Stories of a prior age appear across the globe. The Maya recount previous suns, each destroyed in turn. Hindu cosmology describes ages of rising and declining knowledge. Egyptian lore speaks of Zep Tepi, the first time when gods, or ancestors, established order after chaos. The Greeks remember ages washed away by water or undone by fire. Australian Aboriginal songlines recount landforms swallowed by rising seas more than 10,000 years ago. Memories confirmed by modern geological data. These traditions differ in detail, but all describe a discontinuity between worlds, a rupture, a threshold humanity crossed not once, but repeatedly. Alongside these myths lie material hints. Megalithic structures built with technology that later societies could not replicate. Linguistic isolates whose ancestors remain unknown. Astronomical knowledge requiring millennia of continuity to develop. Monoliths underwater, artifact anomalies, genetic puzzles. And everywhere, the same strange rhythm. The oldest layers are often the most refined. This inverted pattern, sophistication at the beginning, simplification later, makes sense only if those beginnings were not beginnings at all, but survivals. Of course, such ideas make scholars uncomfortable. They challenge linear models. They invite unanswerable questions. They require us to confront the fragility of what we consider known. But discomfort is not evidence. It is merely the feeling that arises when the narrative begins to crack under its own weight. What remains, then, is interpretation. Either early civilizations independently developed advanced knowledge in abrupt, unconnected bursts, a statistical improbability, or they inherited fragments from cultures whose roots lie deeper than the archaeological record can presently reach. This does not require lost continents or futuristic technologies. It requires only this: the humanity is older in its cultural memory than in its surviving artifacts, that the past contains layers erased by forces indifferent to human preservation, that we're standing not at the beginning of the story, but somewhere in its middle chapters. If a predecessor civilization existed, diffuse, fragmented, coastal, observational, it would not appear as a neat line in the archaeological record. It would appear as echoes, as inherited symbols, as inexplicable alignments, as myths that feel too old to be myths, as knowledge without origin, as ruins whose builders deny authorship, as sudden complexity emerging from supposed simplicity. And that is precisely what we observe. But such conclusions cannot be drawn cleanly. They are shadows, not shapes, outlines, not portraits. We are left with a sense of presence without identity, an unknown culture standing behind the curtain of history, seen only in the movements of those who came after. The silence surrounding that culture is not empty. It is dense, weighted, pressurized. It is the silence left when something significant withdraws from view, but not from influence. A silence that demands neither belief nor rejection, but contemplation. And so a question lingers, quiet but persistent, like the fading footprint of someone who walked ahead of us long before our own path began. If the world we know was shaped by the echoes of an older civilization, then what kind of people were they? And why did they leave behind only the faintest trace of their existence? There is a kind of silence that does not come from the absence of sound, but from the presence of something too large, too ancient, too patient to speak in ways we immediately recognize. It is the silence that lingers in deserts where vanished rivers once flowed, in chambers carved by hands whose names we will never know, in star patterns mirrored by monuments older than recorded time. It is the silence of a story half told, one whose missing chapters do not lie in libraries or archives, but in the very architecture of the earth itself. And as this journey draws toward its final threshold, that silence presses closer, as though inviting us not to solve a mystery, but to acknowledge that the mystery has been watching us the entire time. For throughout these inquiries into lost languages, vanished coastlines, megalithic structures, astronomical alignments, and dangerous knowledge, one theme has followed like a shadow: the sense of an unseen observer, not a divine force, not a supernatural entity, but a presence woven through human history, a memory, a pattern, a remnant, something that the earliest civilizations hinted at without naming directly, something they seemed to feel or remember or fear. The Sumerians called them the Apkallu, the Egyptians called them the followers of Horus. The Maya spoke of beings from earlier suns. The Vedic texts describe rishis who carried knowledge across cosmic cycles. The Greeks remembered titans and heroes from pre-human epochs. The Polynesians spoke of ancestral navigators who came from horizons now swallowed by the sea. These are not identical stories. They do not share details, but they share structure. Humanity inheriting a world already touched by someone older. This recurring motif becomes even more pronounced when one looks at the world's earliest monuments. Göbekli Tepe appears suddenly, built with a sophistication inconsistent with its age. Its builders buried it intentionally, as if concealing a message not meant for their descendants. The hypogeum in Malta resonates at frequencies affecting consciousness. The megaliths of the Andes display engineering skill unmatched by their inheritors. The Sphinx, weathered by water erosion, seems to reflect a climate far older than dynastic Egypt. These structures feel less like beginnings and more like memorials, compasses pointing toward a vanished center. What that center was, we still cannot say. Perhaps a network of coastal societies whose settlements now lie beneath the waves. Perhaps a lineage of knowledge keepers maintaining traditions through cycles of darkness. Perhaps a civilization erased so thoroughly that only its echoes remain embedded in myth and stone. The specifics are lost, but the pattern is not. And what is most striking is that ancient cultures themselves did not claim to be original. They claimed to be restored, re-established, reorganized after calamity. Their earliest texts do not speak with the pride of inventors, but with the humility of heirs, heirs to something they struggle to preserve or even understand. Yet for all these echoes, the silence remains unbroken. Whatever predecessor may have existed left no clear message, no surviving manuscript, no definitive artifact announcing its presence. It left fragments, not declarations. It left orientation, not identity. It left questions that seemed designed not to be answered easily, but to guide the human mind toward deeper contemplation of its own origins. In a way, that absence is more haunting than any physical ruin. It suggests intention, not deliberate concealment necessarily, but something even more enigmatic, the possibility that humanity was meant to rediscover itself slowly, layer by layer, as if guided not by external revelation, but by internal awakening. Civilization, then, becomes a process of remembering rather than learning. The stillness surrounding the earliest epochs of human existence, those millennia drowned beneath seas, buried under ice, forgotten beneath shifting sands, may not signify a lack of history. It may signify a history too profound to survive in ordinary form. Catastrophe has a way of purifying memory, reducing it to symbols, dreams, and rituals. Knowledge becomes myth, and myth becomes silence. And yet, silence is not emptiness, it is potential. Within that silence lies an invitation to re-examine the assumptions that shape our understanding of the past. We assume progress is linear, but the evidence whispers otherwise. We assume humanity began in darkness and rose into light, but the earliest records hinted a prior illumination. We assume myths are metaphors, but they may be memories. Distorted, yes, but not fabricated. If a predecessor civilization existed, it did not disappear because it was primitive. More likely, it vanished because the earth itself shifted beneath its feet. Through floods, climate reversals, tectonic upheavals. Or perhaps it fragmented internally, losing coherence until its knowledge dispersed into the hands of wandering survivors. Or perhaps it chose deliberately to step back from the world, allowing a new cycle to rise. And this raises a final, trembling possibility. The great silence in our history is not an accident. It may be a boundary, a veil between cycles, a necessary amnesia that allows each age to rediscover what it's ready to understand and to forget what it's not yet prepared to carry. For if the knowledge of earlier ages came too quickly, too completely, would we recognize its value, or would we misuse it, as myths have worn so often? Would the burden of remembering too much break us before we could stand? Perhaps the predecessor civilization sensed this. Perhaps they understood that some truths can be transmitted only through hints, through stone alignments, through mythic archetypes, through linguistic echoes, through astronomical patterns. Wisdom disguised as mystery, waiting for new minds to decipher it. This is not to romanticize the unknown, nor to assert conclusions where none exist. It is simply to acknowledge the gentle, persistent pull of the question that has underlined this entire journey. Why does the human story begin with a gap? And more importantly, why does that gap feel inhabited? As this exploration reaches its final pause, the question remains open, deliberate, unclaimed by any single explanation. It lingers like a soft imprint on the surface of time, asking us not to close the book, but to hold it loosely, knowing the pages missing may yet reveal themselves when the world is ready. And so the silence continues, steady and watchful, not an ending, but a presence, not a void, but a threshold. And one cannot help but wonder, quietly, almost reverently, if something once stood behind the first civilizations, something wise, ancient, and now withdrawn, has it truly vanished? Or is it simply waiting for us to learn how to listen again?